We welcome you to the Bible study today on Ecclesiastes chapter 7. If you will, please turn in your Bibles to this chapter and let's begin our study tonight. Ecclesiastes 7, 1 through 4, we see the value of mourning. Verse 1, a good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death than the day of one's birth. Solomon taught that a good name or reputation is better than precious ointment. Other versions read good ointment and fine perfume. Generous hosts treated their guests to fine oils and ointments for the anointing of their heads. Such as in Proverbs 22 and 1, we see a good name is to be chosen rather than great riches, loving favor than silver or gold. Proverbs 27 and verse 9, ointment and perfume delight the heart, and sweetness of a man's friend gives delight by hearty counsel. Solomon also taught that the day of death is better than the day of birth. How so? When one is born, he has no reputation. However, with an honorable life, there is a good name. There will be those who mourn the death with honor. For more information, I would suggest reading Ecclesiastes 6, verses 3 to 4. Solomon wrote of the dishonor of those who he said who had no burial. He who has no burial in verse 3 of Ecclesiastes 6. He also wrote of the child who died before birth, whose name is covered with darkness, in Ecclesiastes 6 and 4. That is, the one who dies without a good name or without a reputation. And so there's the background of what we see here. Verse 2, better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting, for that is the end of all men, and the living will take it to heart. Solomon noted the value of a good name and the day of death. Look back at verse 1. The house of mourning is the place of mourning for the dead. While there is celebration for the day of one's birth, perhaps with feasting, there is the honor of those who have lived and die with a good name. The day of death comes to all men. Those who attend the house of mourning to lament the death of a good man may take it to heart. Perhaps they will consider the brevity of life and choose to live wisely in the fear of the Lord. Psalm 90 and verse 12, the psalmist said, "So teach us to number our days, that we may gain a heart of wisdom." Verse 3, sorrow is better than laughter, for by a sad countenance the heart is made better. Sorrow is better than laughter. In this context, one may choose to go in sorrow to the house of mourning at the day of death. There is value, according to Solomon, the value of sorrow over laughter. In time of mourning, there's the consideration, for example, of one's mortality and the edification to live better lives. He said, for by a sad countenance the heart is made better. How so? Well, one possibility is that a sad countenance or face is an indication of sorrow. And with the feelings of sorrow or grief, the heart is made better or well or pleasing. With such serious and thoughtful considerations, hopefully they will be made wiser. Solomon is not teaching that we should always seek sorrow or that one should always avoid laughter. Not at all. There's value in laughter. And here he's pointing out the value of sorrow, of mourning. In the context, Solomon is teaching that there is value in the sorrow of mourning over laughter, of feasting and mirth. And so the point men will take it to heart. Men will consider it their own mortality. Sometimes the death of another is motivation to consider one's own mortality and to make needed changes in their life. Ecclesiastes 3 and verse 4, he says that there is a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance. Verse 4, the heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. Here Solomon is teaching that it is wiser to share in sorrow at the house of mourning than to share in laughter and feasting at the house of mirth. Some versions for mirth read pleasure. Verses 5 through 7, we see the value of rebuke. Like sorrow, sometimes we think, what could be the value of rebuke? Well, there is value in rebuke, and we'll see that here in this section. Verse 5, it is better to hear the rebuke of the wise than for a man to hear the song of fools. For many, the song is more pleasant than the rebuke. However, there is great meaning in heeding the rebuke of the wise. With stern reproof of faults, one may gain understanding to the benefit of his soul. The song of the foolish are empty words. Might sound good, might sound pleasant, but what does it mean? Proverbs 15, 31 to 34. Solomon wrote, the ear that hears the rebukes of life will abide among the wise. He who disdains instruction despises his own soul, but he who heeds rebuke gets understanding. The fear of the Lord is the instruction of wisdom, and before honor is humility. Verse 6. For like the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of the fool. This also is vanity. Someone might hastily put thorns into a fire in order to heat a pot of food. With their thin bark, the thorns will quickly burn in the fire with the sound of crackling. However, they will not create any lasting heat in order to continue to heat the pot. The term crackling may literally be translated as sound or voice. Likewise, so is the laughter of the fool. Their words have little substance of worth, and so he says, this is vanity. David writes about the judgment of God, and he writes about how the judgment of God will come quickly on the wicked. As burning thorns that quickly burn and produce intense heat, so will God's judgment come quickly. Psalm 58 in verse 9, he uses this same metaphor. Before your pots can fill the burning thorns, he will take them away as with a whirlwind, as in his living and burning wrath. And so before your pots can fill the burning thorns. And so this is a metaphor for something which happens intensely but quickly. And so like here, you might have a crackling of the thorns under a pot. It might produce a lot of noise, get a lot of attention, much like the laughter of fool, but with little value. He says this is also vanity. Verse 7, surely oppression destroys a wise man's reason, and a bribe debases the heart. As a man oppresses another, his ability to reason is destroyed. Oppression can bring a wise man to madness, to behave and to think in a way that is foolish. A bribe, whether given or received, debases the heart. The problem was not the gift. Passages like Genesis 25 and 6 and Esther 9 and 22 describe that the problem was not the gift. The problem was the motive of the gift. In the law, Moses wrote, And you shall take no bribe, for a bribe blinds the discerning and perverts the words of the righteous. Exodus 23:8. And so you shall take no gift, or you shall take no bribe. That is a gift given with the intent of perverting the words, of blinding a discerning heart. When a man takes a bribe, his heart is debased. With a bribe, someone attempts to influence the judgment or the conduct of a man in a position of trust with the promise of money or a favor. By taking a bribe, his heart is debased, lowered in respect for trust. This may include the person who would give a bribe as well as receive a bribe. Both are injured. Proverbs 15:27, he who is greedy for gain troubles his own house, but he who hates bribes will live. In this passage, it is said that oppression destroys reason. The same term is also translated as madness in Ecclesiastes 2:2. The term translated here as debases is also translated as perishes in Ecclesiastes 7:15 and destroys in Ecclesiastes 9:18. The idea here of receiving bribes is that it can destroy the heart, particularly debasing or corrupting the mind. For example, in the New Testament, Titus 2:7, Paul admonished Titus to be an example of good works and deeds. He says, in doctrine, showing integrity, reverence, and incorruptibility. Titus 2 in verse 7. Number 3, we see the value of patience. Verse 8. He says, the end of a thing is better than its beginning. The patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. The lesson here is to be patient. With patience, one can wait until the end of a thing and see the fruit of his labor. The completion of a project is better than the beginning of the project. There's two aspects here to patience. First, there's the patient man who is steadfast despite difficulties. He perseveres. Second, the patient man shows forbearance. He's slow to anger. Being patient is better than being proud. While pride and anger stir up strife, patience allays contentions. God blesses those who are humble and patient, rather than those who are proud and who act hastily. Solomon said in Proverbs 16:18-19, pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. Better to be of a humble spirit with the lowly than to divide the spoil with the proud. Also in Proverbs 28:25, he who is of a proud heart stirs up strife, but he who trusts in the Lord will be prospered. Verse 9, do not hasten in your spirit to be angry, for anger rests in the bosom of fools. The lesson is, do not be quick to anger. To be angry without a cause is foolish. It's better to be patient in spirit than to be proud in spirit or angry in spirit. For example, Solomon said in Proverbs 14:17, a quick-tempered man acts foolishly, and a man of wicked intentions is hated. Also in Proverbs 15:18, a wrathful man stirs up strife, but he who is slow to anger allays contention. In this passage, the word bosom refers to the chest, literally. However, figuratively, the chest is given as the seat of emotions, where emotions come from. Another version reads heart. And so do not hasten in your spirit to be angry, for anger rests in the bosom, rests in the heart of fools. And so the place, the seat of emotion. And so the figure describes how anger rests in the fool, ready to be awakened by the first provocation. Sometimes it doesn't take much for some people. Verse 10, Do not say, why were the former days better than these? For you did not inquire wisely concerning this. Someone might ask why the former days were better than the latter days. It may be well true. However, in this case, the one asking the question, according to Solomon, does so foolishly. People often complain about the present and praise the former days. You know, the good old days. There's a problem of selective memory with many people. They talk about the good old days, remembering with affection those pleasant memories while forgetting those things which were unpleasant. They might be ignorant of their past. Instead, he says, be patient in spirit. Do not boast in pride about the past. Do not blame your problems on others in anger. Instead, be steadfast, despite the difficulties, willing to bear hardships calmly and without complaint. And so here we see in verses 8 to 10 the value of patience. Verses 11 to 12, we see the value of wisdom. Verse 11, wisdom is good with an inheritance and profitable to those who see the sun. And so here Solomon is saying that wisdom is an inheritance. Wisdom with an inheritance is good and profitable to those living in the world. Verse 12, for wisdom is a defense, as money is a defense. But the excellence of knowledge is that wisdom gives life to those who have it. And so wisdom is good and profitable. Solomon argues that wisdom is a defense for the wise. Likewise, money is a defense for the rich. However, the excellence of knowledge is that wisdom gives life to the wise. The point, wisdom excels the profit of money. For example, in Proverbs 3:18, Solomon wrote, she is a tree of life to those who take hold of her, and happy are all who retain her. And in Proverbs 18:10 to 11, the name of the Lord is a strong tower. The righteous run to it and are safe. The rich man's wealth is his strong city, and like a high wall in his own esteem. And so the point here in verse 11 of Proverbs 18, we see that the rich man's wealth is his strong city. And so for him, money is the defense. For the wise, we see those who fear God, their defense is the Lord. For the word defense, other versions read protection or shelter. A more literal translation might be shadow, such as in the shadow of protection from the hot sun. In verses 13 to 14, we see number 5, the wisdom, the will of God. Verses 13, he says, consider the work of God, for who can make straight what he has made crooked? This verse is similar to what we read in Ecclesiastes 1 and 15. What is crooked cannot be made straight, and what is lacking cannot be numbered. Earlier, Solomon used these words as an expression of futility. He had seen all the works of man in this world and found that all is vanity and grasping for the wind. Back in Ecclesiastes 1, 14 and 15. Later, he taught that there is a time for every purpose in Ecclesiastes 3, 1 to 8. We see in verse 11 that man cannot always understand the work of God living in this world. Of course, just because we do not understand does not mean that God does not know and that God does not work. Verse 14, in the day of prosperity be joyful, but in the day of adversity consider. Surely God has appointed the one as well as the other, so that man can find out nothing that will come after him. In this world, there are times of prosperity and there are times of adversity. When there is prosperity, Solomon said, be joyful. However, when there is adversity, consider that the one comes as does the other. There are both adversity and prosperity in this world. Solomon taught that there's a time for every purpose under heaven in Ecclesiastes 3:1. No man knows what will happen in the future. That's why it's so very important to consider the will of God. Not my will, but your will be done. We ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will do this or that. That's the lesson taught by James in the New Testament. Number 6, we see various observations and rules given by Solomon in verses 15 to 29. Verse 15, he says, I have seen everything in my days of vanity. There is a just man who perishes in his righteousness, and there is a wicked man who prolongs life in his wickedness. And so Solomon says, I've seen everything in my days of vanity. People today sometimes say, now I have seen everything. Things that may have at one time surprised him or shocked him, he can now say that he has seen everything. Sometimes the righteous perish while the wicked live. And so to Solomon, we see this was not just. This was not fair. How many times have you heard today, life is not always fair? It is generally the case that people who keep the commandments of God in righteousness will have a longer life. Oftentimes, there's adversity or prosperity because of our choices that we make or the choices of others. And those who keep the commandments of God do so in their best interests, as well as the interest of others. Passages such as Proverbs 3:1 and 2, and also verse 16, Proverbs 4 and verse 10, give the general principles that, generally speaking, those who will follow God and his commandments will see long days. However, there are those exceptions where the wicked have a long life in their wickedness. Sometimes it happens that way. Ecclesiastes 8:12 to 13, for example. Regardless of the length of life or of the just or the wicked, there will be the judgment. And so you may be a righteous man who has a short life, or you may be a wicked man who has a long life, or vice versa. Regardless, we will all face judgment, according to Solomon. Verse 16, do not be overly righteous, nor be overly wise. Why should you destroy yourself? He begins here, do not be overly righteous. Another version reads, excessively. How can a man be too righteous? The sense of the word in this case may be that he is instead self-righteous. He's convinced of his own righteousness and the wickedness of others. He says, do not be overly wise. Well, how can a man be too wise? Well, in this sense, it may be that he is too wise in the sense that he is self-conceited. He has an exaggerated opinion of his own wisdom. Such attitudes and behaviors as being self-righteous and self-conceited are ultimately self-defeating or self-destructive. I would like you to consider a New Testament example passage in Luke 18 and 9. Perhaps you're familiar with the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. Here's the story of two men who go into the temple to pray. One's a Pharisee and the other's a tax collector. Well, the purpose of the parable of Jesus is to teach that those who trusted in themselves, that they were self-righteous. They were righteous and despised others. So here you have people who trusted in themselves. They thought too highly of themselves. They thought themselves righteous while looking down on everyone else. Luke 18:9, I think, is very pertinent to what we see here in Ecclesiastes 7 and 16. Verse 17, do not be overly wicked, nor be foolish. Why should you die before your time? And so he says, do not be overly wicked or excessively wicked. How can a man be too wicked? Well, surely any degree of wickedness is too much wickedness. It may be that the person gives themselves over to wickedness, such as in the book of Romans, chapter 1, we read about those who had given themselves over to sin. So it may be the case that he's describing here those who are too wicked, those who have given themselves, they're not only practicing wickedness, they've given themselves over to wickedness. A man given to wickedness is unlikely to turn from evil and be delivered from his sin. Ecclesiastes 8 and verse 8. Do not be foolish, he says. Be wise and depart from evil. Consider the Proverbs of Solomon in Proverbs 13 to 19. It is an abomination to fools to depart from evil. And in Proverbs 14:16, a wise man fears and departs from evil, but a fool rages and is self-confident. Solomon says, why should you die before your time? Well, we know from passages like Hebrews 9 and 27 that it is appointed for man to die once, and after this, the judgment. And so there is an appointed day to die. There's an appointed day to be judged. Man will die, yes, and man will also be judged too, according to Hebrews 9 and 27. In Ecclesiastes 3 and 17, Solomon wrote, God shall judge the righteous and the wicked. Whatever Solomon intended to teach, he did not mean that a man can be moderately wicked and be acceptable to God. This would be contrary to the whole of Scriptures. Verse 18, it is good that you grasp this, and also not remove your hand from the other, for he who fears God will escape them all. And so he says that it is good that you heed these warnings, like we see in verses 16 to 17. The man who fears God will, quote, escape them all. He will escape the consequences of those who are overly righteous or overly wise, who are overly wicked or foolish. A more literal translation might be, come forth from all of them. And so the man who fears God will come forth from them who are condemned. Consider that those who are guilty of being overly righteous or overly wise, they do not fear God. That's something to consider. Verse 19. Wisdom strengthens the wise more than 10 rulers of the city. Solomon teaches that a man with wisdom may be stronger than 10 men of great might. The victory of battle does not always go to the strong. To coin a phrase from Ecclesiastes 9 and verse 11. We'll get to that later, Lord willing. Proverbs 24, 5 to 6, Solomon wrote, a wise man is strong. Yes, a man of knowledge increases strength. For by wise counsel you will wage your own war, and in a multitude of counselors there is safety. And so you see the wisdom in heeding the advice of wise advisors. Proverbs 21, 22, a wise man scales the city of the mighty and brings down the trusted stronghold. And so the wise can be mightier than the mighty. Solomon later in the book of Ecclesiastes tells the story of a poor wise man who by his wisdom delivered a little city with only a few people in it. You'll see that in Ecclesiastes 9, 14 to 15. Verse 20, for there is not a just man on earth who does good and does not sin. There's not a just man on earth who always does good and who never sins. All men have sinned. We see this taught in other passages in the Bible. It is true that there are just men, and it is true that there are men who do good. In other passages, Solomon contrasts men who are good in God's sight with men who are sinners, those who practice sin. In Ecclesiastes 2 and 26 and 7 in verse 26. While there are just men, all men have sinned. In the prayer of Solomon, he said, "For there is no one who does not sin." We see this in 1 Kings 8 and 46 and 2 Chronicles 6 and 36. In the New Testament, we find similar language. For example, the Apostle John wrote, "If we say we have not sinned, we make him a liar, and the truth is not in us," in 1 John 1 and 10. And in his epistle to the Romans, Paul argued that the Jews and the Gentiles were all charged under sin. The term Gentile refers to a non-Jew. And so whether one was a Jew or a non-Jew, everyone was charged under sin, Jew and Gentile alike. He wrote, "There is none righteous, no, not one, and there is none who does good, no, not one," in Romans 3, 10 to 12. He cites Psalm 14, 1 to 3, and Psalm 53, 1 to 3 as support for his argument. So basically here in verse 20, Solomon is basically teaching that there's not a just man on earth who always does good and who never sins. All men have sinned. Verse 21. "Also, do not take to heart everything people say, lest you hear your servant cursing you." Do not take to heart everything people say. There's an English idiom today, do not take to heart. We use this to refer to someone who is hurt by hearing something that was said. The point here is, do not be deeply afflicted or affected or hurt by the words of others. Other versions read, take seriously or pay attention. And so do not take it to heart or pay attention to everything which is said. For example, you may hear your servant cursing you. He says, do not take it to heart. Sometimes employees and employers, sometimes employees may say things about their employer. Right or wrong, it is done. Here, Solomon advises, do not take it to heart. Sometimes people say things out of frustration. They're tired, they're hungry, they're thirsty, they're sick. Sometimes these things can affect our ability to exercise self-control. Solomon here advises, do not take to heart everything that people say. Verse 22, for many times also your own heart has known that even you have cursed others. Certainly this isn't true of all people. There are those who have not cursed others. However, generally speaking, it's the case that many have done so. Do not take to heart every curse you hear, for you know how many times you yourself have cursed others. And again, generally speaking, it's the case that many have done so. Think too of how many idle words are spoken. If the word curse gives you pause, think of idle words. How many times have you spoken idly, flippantly, without thinking, for whatever reason? You didn't genuinely mean what you said. You would hope that others would be patient with you. Well, likewise, try to be patient with others too. We don't always know what people may be experiencing in their life, whether it's prosperity or adversity, as we know is bound to happen in this world. Solomon warns in Ecclesiastes 10 and 20, people ought not to curse the king or the rich, even in privacy. He says, for they may find out somehow. So there's some words to consider in Ecclesiastes 10 and 20. Verse 23, all this I have proved by wisdom. I said, I will be wise, but it was far from me. And so Solomon says that all these things I have proved by wisdom. Other versions read, tested. At the beginning of the book, Solomon wrote how he had set his heart to seek and to search out by wisdom concerning all that is done under heaven, Ecclesiastes 1 and 13. And how he tested his heart with such things as mirth and pleasure and laughter in Ecclesiastes 2 and verse 1. Solomon said, I will be wise. At some time in his past, he thought that he was wise. He's wise enough to understand the work of God. He learned, though, that no one can find out the work that God does from beginning to end. Ecclesiastes 3 and 11. Here we see Solomon humbly acknowledging, but it was far from me. He said, I will be wise, but it was far from me. Ecclesiastes 8, 16 to 17. When I applied my heart to know wisdom and to see the business that is done on earth, even though no one sees sleep day or night, then I saw all the work of God, that a man cannot find out the work that is done under the sun. For though a man labors to discover it, yet he will not find it. Moreover, a wise man attempts to know it, he will not be able to find it. So Solomon later writes these words in Ecclesiastes 8, 16 to 17. And so here we see Solomon humbled. Verse 24, as for that which is far off and exceedingly deep, who can find it out? Solomon humbly acknowledged that he could not find out all the work of God in verse 23. And in this passage, it appears that he questioned whether anyone could find it out. Consider this, the wisest man of his time described it as far off and exceedingly deep, or mysterious, profound, the work of God. This literal translation of deep describes the extreme distance between man and full understanding of God's work. We may know a portion of God's work in this world, but we certainly do not fully understand God and his will. Romans 11 and verse 33, Paul praised God, saying, oh, the depth and the riches, both of the wisdom and the knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments and his ways past finding out. Here, Solomon in verse 24 says, who can find it out? Verse 25, I applied my heart to know, to search, and to seek out wisdom and the reason of things, to know the wickedness of folly, even of foolishness and madness. Solomon applied his heart, he turned his heart, he directed his heart to know wisdom and the reason, the explanation of things. He also applied his heart to know the wickedness of folly, even foolishness and madness. Note the terms that he used to describe his endeavor: to know, to search, to seek. Here we see his earnest endeavor. Ecclesiastes 1 and 17, he said, and I set my heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. I perceived that all, this also is grasping for the wind. Verse 26, and I find more bitter than death the woman whose heart is snares and nets, whose hands are fetters. He who pleases God shall escape from her, but the sinner shall be trapped by her. The thought of death can be distressing. It's the great unknown. Solomon later writes, for man does not know his time. Like fish taken in a cruel net, like birds caught in a snare. Ecclesiastes 9 and 12. However, to Solomon, the immoral woman was more bitter to him than death. See Proverbs 5, 1 to 6, for example. Solomon also often wrote about the immoral woman in the book of Proverbs. He described being trapped by her as if her heart was a snare or a net, and her hands were fetters or chains or bonds, which held him captive. When Solomon was older, we see that women had turned his heart away from God. Solomon loved many foreign women, and we see that he yielded to temptation and sinned. This history is recorded in 1 Kings 11, 1-8. Solomon contrasts he who pleases God with the sinner. He who is good before God shall escape the immoral. He who will fear God and keep his commandments, resist temptation and flee from these lusts. However, he says the sinner shall be trapped by her. I wonder if he speaks of himself. We know from earlier in our study of Ecclesiastes that Solomon had tested his heart with pleasure. One of the things that he said he acquired were the delights of the sons of men in Ecclesiastes 2:8. In addition to singers and musical instruments to please him, we see that he acquired what he referred to as the delights or the pleasures of the sons of men. These may have included women as well. Near the end of the book, after his search for meaning, he reached the conclusion: fear God and keep his commandments. Ecclesiastes 12 and 13. Did Solomon repent of his sins and turn back to God? I don't know that the Bible explicitly states that he repented and turned back to God. However, for me, it is difficult to believe that a man such as Solomon could teach this as man's all, the whole duty of man, and yet not come to do so. I would like to think that Solomon did repent and that he acknowledges his sin here in the book of Ecclesiastes and the need, finally, most importantly, to seek God, to fear him, fear God, and keep his commandments. Solomon tried many things, tested his heart in many ways, but ultimately he found these things vanity and true meaning in fearing God and following his word. Verse 27. Here is what I have found, says the preacher, adding one thing to the other to find out the reason. Solomon applied his heart to seek out the reason of things in this world, in this life. In Ecclesiastes 7 and 25. He searched by adding one thing to another, one by one, looking at everything, looking at both men and women. What did he find? Well, he did find one thing, and we see that in Ecclesiastes 7 and 29. We'll get to it in a moment. Verse 28. He says, which my soul still seeks, but I cannot find. One man among 1,000 I have found, but a woman among all these I have not found. And so Solomon says, as of yet, he was still searching, still seeking out the reason of things in this world, in this life. In his search, he didn't learn that there are few people who are truly upright, who are good before God and who please him. In his experience, there was one upright man and no upright women out of 1,000 people. Solomon, as you look at this passage, speaks of men and women. Is Solomon insulting or belittling women in this passage? Not at all. If he is, he hardly spoke any better of the men. Think about it. There's only one man out of 1,000 men that he found to be upright. The 1,000 here, I believe, are people. It may include men and women, not just men or just women, not just 1,000 men or 1,000 women, but 1,000 people. And so if out of 1,000 people he found one man, that doesn't speak very highly for the men. And it's hardly any better than none out of 1,000. So no, Solomon is not insulting or belittling women. Instead, in the book of Proverbs, we see that he teaches concerning women. And yes, he does include warnings about immoral women. And we do know from his history how Solomon married foreign women who turned his heart after other gods, so that his heart was not loyal to the Lord his God. How that he did evil and he did not fully follow the Lord. And so passages like 1 Kings 11, 1-8, we can see the wisdom in what he says in the book of Proverbs. And we can see the folly of some of the things that he did in his life, such as in 1 Kings 11, 1-8. In Proverbs 11 and 16, we see that Solomon spoke highly of those women who are gracious, contrasted with those who are ruthless. And so those who are full of compassion and grace and mercy, compared to those who are ruthless. In Proverbs 11 and 16, he also spoke highly of those women who are wise in Proverbs 14 and verse 1, contrasted with those men who are foolish. So we see in Proverbs 14 and 1 and Proverbs 11, 16, how he does speak highly of women, those who are wise and those who are gracious, some more so than the men. We also see that he incorporated the words of King Lemuel in Proverbs, last chapter, which included the poem of the virtuous wife or virtuous woman. In Proverbs 31, 10-31, this is some of the greatest statements found in the Bible, and it's in praise of the virtuous woman. He says, but a woman who fears the Lord, she shall be praised, in Proverbs 31 and 30. So here in this passage in verse 28, he's simply describing that in his experience, there were few upright people. Verse 29, truly this only have I found, that God made man upright, but they have sought out many schemes. Earlier, Solomon the preacher said, here's what I found. Verse 27. What did he find? He found that God made man upright, but they sought out many schemes, many devices. While God would have had man seek his will and be upright and do good, man sadly often seeks his own plans. He schemes, he plots, he makes ploy. Man goes his own way, regardless of the will of God. And God would have him to do what's right, and often man schemes. He makes his own plans. He follows his own devices. Proverbs 2 and 13, it says, from those who leave the paths of uprightness to walk in the ways of darkness. I would suggest reading verse 13 in its context to better appreciate what he's saying there. But here you have a glimpse of those who leave the paths of uprightness and who begin walking in the paths of darkness instead. God made man upright, but he has sought out many schemes. Proverbs 24, verses 8-9, he who plots to do evil will be called a schemer. The devising of foolishness is sin, and the scoffer is an abomination to men. We hope that this lesson has been helpful in understanding Ecclesiastes chapter 7. Lord willing, next time we'll study chapter 8. We encourage you to continue to study on your own. We had to move rather quickly to get through this chapter. There's a lot to be said, and we're glad that you were here to study with us.